Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Jason Barbado. It is awesome for you to join us today on what may be your lunch break. Maybe it's a little early, a little late. Just had my lunch a few minutes before jumping in, so I'm feeling good. Ready to again chat some experimentation with you. One of my favorite things throughout my entire career. So, with that, we will get started. I want to start out by saying there will be, from a housekeeping standpoint, as you can see, you have the opportunity to chat. You have the opportunity to ask questions, and I absolutely invite you to do so. You can do that on the right side. You can probably see that already. Feel free to drop in any questions, reactions, thoughts, anything that you might have. We will keep our eye on those from our side. And at the end, ideally, it's only about 20 to 30 minutes of me covering my content, and that'll lead us to a casual and open conversation on the things that were covered. So by all means, you're invited to share any comments, questions, etc. in the chat. All right, here you can see what we're going to cover today. I will start out very briefly with a moment on me. Again, my name is Jason Barbado. I am located in dark, dreary, wet, cold, upstate New York. I am coming to you on behalf of Metadata. I am currently a marketing strategy director at Metadata. What that means, really quickly, is that I work with Metadata customers, folks that are using our platform. I align with them on strategy and execution and finding ways to automate and elevate their paid media and their paid ads. It's been an amazing run, and I've been here about 6 months. Once upon a time, I was also a Metadata customer. Enough about that. More relative to the topic today, I feel somewhat qualified to talk about experimentation for a couple of reasons. One, I'm known for developing the IBM Cloud Marketplace Growth Experimentation Program. This was back around 2016, 2017, but myself and a very small team executed over 2,000 experiments that generated over 40 million in ARR, experimenting and testing across a multitude, over 1,000 different SaaS experiences for IBM, which was an amazing experience for my career. I then took that forward, that same model, and developed a growth marketing agency that's centered around experimentation and an experimentation framework. So I would say in my career, at least in the last 7 to 8 years of being a growth marketer, I've probably run 4,000 to 5,000 experiments, which is a lot. And again, I really, really enjoy the space, enjoy this type of work, and I'll elaborate as to why and some of the things that really matter to me when it comes to experimentation and how they may potentially help you with your own efforts. So let's jump in. First, I want to talk about culture. I will always lead with culture when I'm having a conversation about growth experimentation. You've probably seen this very famous quote from Peter Drucker, one of the most famous management consultants in the world. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. And when it comes to experimentation and that word growth, which you've probably already heard me say a couple of times, culture is insanely important. It's a must have. If you are static, if you are complacent, if you work in very long cycles, experimentation might not be for you. It's all about growth culture. It's all about having, again, these qualities that you see down below. They really enable the most meaningful experimentation and testing that you can potentially have, whether that's in the space of paid media, your content, your digital product experience. It can work for anyone or anything. In my past, I've run growth programs with services companies, recruiting firms, accounting firms, folks like that. Experimentation and growth can work for anybody if, again, you have the qualities that I specify down below, and probably then some. So, first and foremost, if you've ever met me, I carry a certain amount of energy. I'm very energized by my work, very energized and excited day to day to wonder what outcome I might be able to drive from an experiment. So having a certain level of energy, again, just as a personal quality, is super important. And again, when we're thinking about culture at a small company, at a startup, this could be culture amongst your entire organization. You want everybody feeling and thinking in the ways that are specified here. Obviously, at a larger company where there's a complex organization, many teams, this may be more cultural to your team versus a really large organization. I just want to call that out. So energy in any case is incredibly important. As you might imagine, so is curiosity. Always wondering, looking at that data every day, looking at those experiments, looking at that creative, whatever it is, and being curious. Is it right? Is it meeting the mark with our audience? Do we internally love it? Is it on brand? Is it conveying the right message? Like, those are perpetual thoughts things that you're always wondering about. You have to have a certain air of curiosity that never leaves you to be really, really effective with your experimentation. So being ever curious is incredibly important. And the one I always package that with in these conversations is never being complacent. You can't be satisfied. You can't accept the status quo. You always want to push the boundaries. You always want to put more stress and pressure on the system. You want to generate more of whatever it is that you're experimenting against. So you never want to be complacent, never satisfied. Inevitably, you want to have a growth mindset. You want to be the type of person or have the type of culture and team where you're always trying to drive usage, drive users, drive revenue, drive clicks. It motivates you. And that's the way that you think. You're always thinking about the ways that you can push those levers and grow yourself, grow against your outcomes and outputs, grow your business. Having that growth mindset is key. Obviously, again, having an eye on data and being analytical is key. Every single day, I'm opening up dashboards and looking at numbers across my different projects. And again, then that curiosity, that energy starts to resonate. Now, the data is telling me this. What do I think about it? How long do I dwell on that metric? How do I act upon what I'm seeing? So being analytical just by default is also super important. Agility. This was an interesting one, agile for me. At IBM, I didn't really believe in agile. But in order to generate those outcomes that I mentioned to you around experimentation, around ARR, MRR at IBM, I had to start believing and essentially adopt that agile methodology. So short cycles, small bites, being very nimble, light on your feet, moving around, making changes, making pivots, kind of moving with the flow of your tests in your business is super important. So sometimes agile can just be the way you work. Sometimes it can be incredibly structured, where you're doing sprints and playbacks and stand-ups and different things that really apply to that methodology. This one's really important. You have to be decisive. You can't sort of linger, whether it's data or intuition, whatever is driving your curiosity, you have to be decisive. Don't take a week to make a decision. Don't run it up and down the flagpole looking for everybody's validation. If you feel strongly about a test or an experiment, you go ahead and run it. And you can see there in parentheses, I say you, I would just reference us as individuals, us amongst our teams. There are also times when it comes to being decisive when maybe it is you and a couple of other folks. It's you and your team. It's you and your leadership. And you can't quite decide which way to go with an experiment. What I always say is when you're in disagreement or you're having healthy debate internally, the best thing you can do, instead of asking yourselves, is run the experiment and ask your audience. That is the essence and the beauty of experimentation, especially when it comes to paid ads, is that you can execute something, you can launch a campaign, and immediately you're asking your audience for their feedback. Those are the folks you want to give you the answer right or wrong. As much as you may feel strongly intuitively about it yourself, ask your audience. Inevitably, every test you run, especially again in paid advertising, is doing just that. So have decisiveness, whether it's among yourselves or it's by saying, you know what, we can't decide, so we're going to ask the people that matter most, our audience, our customers, our leads, our prospects, whoever it is. And then another key piece of this, experiments are intended to move fast. And again, be very agile. So again, this is another case where you don't want to wait. And if it means you getting hands-on in a tool or a channel, writing some ad copy, tweaking creative and Canva, whatever it is, you will get more done in terms of experimentation and growth from a cultural standpoint if you're happy and willing to do things yourself with your own hands on mouse and your own hands on keyboard. So again, you may not have all of these qualities yourself, your team, your organization, but it's important to at least have a few of these. These are all sort of subconscious enablers. These are things that allow you to do more faster and learn more faster, which again is the essence of experimentation. Okay, cool. Moving on. Before I get into this content, hopefully some of you, I may be dating myself a little bit, recognize the funny picture on the right. This is one of my favorite movies of all time, The Big Lebowski. If you haven't seen it, you should. It's hilarious. I've never met anybody who didn't find it to be hilarious. So quick plug for The Big Lebowski. And this is one of the best statements and the most hilarious statements that he makes in the movie. What are we talking about here? What do you consider an experiment to actually be? And therein lies the image in the picture that I put up on the screen. It actually is all relative. It's relative to who you are, where you are, and your cultural progression, how much you've experimented in the past. There may be a little bit of philosophy about what an experiment is or what it means, its magnitude, the metric you're trying to influence. So it's kind of a cheap answer to start, but what defines an experiment is very relative to who you are and where you are. But at the end of the day, the other qualities that you see here on the screen matter every time, and they truly do sum up what an experiment is. So in my mind, and I've always said this all the way back to my days at IBM and all the places I've been in between, I believe that an experiment is any net new intervention you're making in any journey anywhere. It could be changing a headline. It could be changing creative. It could be capitalizing your ad copy. It could be very, very small and minimal things. But again, if you're making a change of any type, any intervention that is influencing experience, that to me is considered an experiment. A few more qualities that are super important here. Experiment, going back to that agile statement I made before, experiments should always happen in short cycles. So if you're a customer, if you're in a place now where you're viewing things monthly, that isn't necessarily a short cycle. Obviously, and this may come up in our chat or the Q&A later, there's that aspect of statistical significance, like how long and how much data gives you yes or no on an experiment. So short cycles is also a bit relative. Like, yeah, you want to make sure that you're pulling enough data from a test to really validate right from wrong. But again, if you're viewing that in the course of a month, 6 weeks, a quarter, to me that is not an experiment. Experiments are agile and they're small bites. So you may iterate on a given intervention 3 or 4 times in a month versus saying, okay, we're going to let this thing run for a month. I would imagine nobody here has such small amount of traffic, such small amount of engagement on your ads that you wouldn't be able to identify a short cycle. A lot of times by default, if I have to choose, and this was a part of my agency model back in the day, was 2 weeks. 2 weeks, we would launch, track, pause, reflect, iterate in about a 2 week increment. But again, it really depends. That may just be a good default to start at 2 weeks. In any case, short cycles, small bites. That's how we should view experiments. As you think about it, again, I mentioned this before. Like I said, any intervention that is changing an experience. So that's the tangible part. Someone's coming to a website, someone's viewing an ad, someone's reading content, and there's a noticeable change in that experience for them. That is an absolute quality of experiments. Another one, as I've already alluded to, the next one down, incremental data change. That word incremental is important. I've already brought up the topic of statistical significance, but we have to do it again in small bites. If you turn an experiment on and you are seeing the signals, you're seeing the data change in the data pattern, even if it's small, that is favoring the outcome or the hypothesis you were looking for, great. You're getting the signal, you're getting the indicator. So it doesn't have to be going from 1 to 10 or 1 to 100. It can be from 1 to 2 or 3. Again, it all depends on where you're starting and what your sample is. As long as you see an indicator that things are improving or changing, that is considered an experiment in my mind. And then finally, I say this constantly. Experiments are all about pushing the boundaries, not doing those static things, not being complacent, going back to some of those cultural topics. You are always considering out on the edges, out on the fringes in the work that you're doing, how can we push? How can we apply pressure to the boundaries and sort of the standards that we have for our ads, for our content, for our copy, for our video, whatever it is? Keep pushing those boundaries. When you're not doing that, it may still be viewed as a test or an experiment, but it probably won't be as meaningful. So you always want to push the boundaries. Okay, moving forward, a little bit more on definition. There are other qualities that are really, really important to a great experiment. And I've got a couple of them up here on the screen, and you can probably see just a couple of different views. So, other things that really lend themselves to a meaningful, scalable experimentation program. If you look at the left, one of them is velocity. You could call it velocity, you could call it volume. Whichever way you want to label it, the more experiments you run, the better your odds. What you're seeing is a view from a report that we put out in September that's pretty interesting. I'll be sure to make sure that we provide this link to you after the session for what it's worth, given it's so topical. But this is a study that we did at Metadata, just to simply show the channel and the experiment count mix, and how they're actually driving ROI and they're driving pipeline for metadata customers. Now, I'm not necessarily suggesting, yeah, these numbers look huge. And again, by the way, this is a 90-day sample. I'm sorry, it's a 180-day sample. So when you see 0 to 100 experiments, 500, 1,000, 2,000, remember, this is essentially a 6-month sample that we're talking about. So it's a long period of time. I would never say you must run 100 experiments this month or this sprint or whatever it is. No, again, your velocity and your volume is again a bit relative to who you are, the resources you have, the tools that you have. But what's most important is that you actually have volume and velocity, meaning you're running experiments on the regular, perpetually. Maybe they're turned on and off and you're iterating, but at any given time, you always have a multitude of experiments running and you're testing and tweaking different things. So velocity is incredibly important. Over on the right, this one is a little bit different and unique. This is more of a freehand back of the napkin study that I did for one of my metadata customers a couple months ago, I should say. Time is incredibly important. So while you want to have volume and velocity, you also need to give your experiments a little bit of time. The visual that you see was a study, again, that I did for one of my customers here at Metadata. And we had actually a pretty poor month at the time. And in kind of peeking under the hood at how we were executing, it became very clear to me. You can see the breakdown here. So in this case, time can mean two things. It can mean time, actual time, days, hours, weeks, months, whatever it is. It can be actual time, but it's also time in terms of what you're investing in an experiment. And that's where you see the spend range column. So in this particular study, over a month's time, we did 259 experiments on this customer's project. And what I found, we did not have a good month. Like I said, it was the poorest month I think we've had to date. And the reason was, as a collective, we were turning things off too fast. You can see over 80% of the experiments never stood a chance. We didn't even put $100 in ad spend to 213 out of our 259 experiments. And inevitably, look what the output was. Look at our outcomes. One lead, one MQL, nothing that was not much of anything handed off to sales, no ops, no pipeline. And again, these experiments never stood a chance because we didn't give them time. We didn't give them an appropriate amount of spend to really get up and let our audience, again, validate for us, yes or no. Then as you look, we built up a few more here, about 30 that got to the next threshold of spend, about 12% of our experiments, and look what happened. We got more leads, we got more MQLs, we even sourced an opportunity in some pipeline. Then as you progress up to the next threshold of spend, we cut that 30 into 15. It's only 6% of our experiments, but look at our outcomes. Best outcomes of any segment in this little study. We had 9 MQLs, got an op out of the deal. And then the one that we actually made it to 500. And again, I guess, by the way, it's really important to call out this project, this customer, we're spending about $25,000 a month, which again adds some of that relativity. So when you think about the 500 out of the 25,000, it's a decent slice of the budget and of the pot. But you can see we only had one experiment that made it to that level, and it did okay. So again, sort of the summary here is you got to give these time, and you have to do them in groups. You have to do lots of them to see the best outcomes. Okay, moving on. As promised, a few examples, a few of my favorite and sort of low-hanging examples across some of the primary ad channels that we work with at Metadata with a lot of our projects and customers. You can see we've got Google Ads, we've got LinkedIn, and we've got Meta Ads, which are really core to, again, the ad channels that we're working with day to day. Some of these may not be that profound, but when I'm trying to convince a customer, a client, whomever it is, to start experimenting, these are easy ways to convince them. They're easy experiments to run on these ad channels. So I'll elaborate on them just very briefly. And by all means, you can reach out to me after this and we can brainstorm experiments for you that would be helpful to you. I have an ideation framework, a scoring framework to prioritize your experiments. There's many things we can do to make this very, very specific to you and your use case in your program. But for now, zooming out, almost anybody can use any of these experiments. So over here with Google Ads, pinning headlines. This is a relatively new feature that we're seeing, but I would advocate for it all day. It's an easy way to test. What do you drop into position 1? What do you drop into position 2? Where does your brand fall within whatever you're advertising or your offer? Are you shuffling your pins around? So week 1, the thing that was pinned in 1 can then in week 2 become position 3, etc. So it's moving your placements around inside of your Google Ads. Another thing that a lot of us are probably accustomed to is sending your Google Ads to your homepage of your website, to a microsite, to a landing page, whatever the case may be. One that I find interesting and is a bit underutilized is actually leveraging and elevating the lead magnet itself, saying, hey, we've got this great ebook, we've got this annual report, we've got this webinar, whatever it is. Actually serve that up similar to how you would be pointing to a homepage or a landing page. Offer up and articulate your lead magnets in your Google Ads. It's a great experiment because you may find better engagement. Again, thinking about who you're trying to reach. If it's folks that are at the top of the funnel, they're considering, they're in discovery, they're researching, it may work just as well as sending them to your homepage, which may overwhelm them. Send them to a specific lead magnet that's contextual to your keywords and your copy. Match types are an obvious one. We know they've been around a while. We know for the most part, Google is trying to force you towards broad match, and a lot of times that's okay. But more times than not, when I'm starting out and building a new campaign, a new ad group, whatever it is, at least for a small bit of time, I like to experiment with all match types. We'll get some phrase in there. We'll get some exact in there. We'll get some broad in there. So then we can compare and see exactly which ones are working at the right amount of value, the right amount of spend for our audience. Obviously, you can turn things off very quickly. There's a lot of science to Google Ads, but that is another one that I would suggest is simply, when needed, testing your match types and not by default saying, okay, it's this one or that one. Obviously, you have to be mindful of cost. These different match types will cost you differently. But again, it's worthwhile to see exactly what resonates with your audience. The last one is extensions. This is sort of a playground. For me, it's a sandbox. You can work with extensions all day, which, when we're thinking about call extensions, snippets, site link extensions, all the different things that you can put in there. There are many ways to lay them out, how you order them, the pages, the statements that you're making. They can be shuffled and experimented with perpetually. And you may find that a certain mix works really well with a certain ad group or a certain campaign. So that's a couple ideas on Google Ads. Moving to LinkedIn. These are some of my favorites that have been sort of proven out over time. One that I always like to call out. One, hopefully you're doing conversational ads already, even if it's foundationally, because they are amongst the best value you can get on LinkedIn. But once you start to do them and sort of scale them, I would strongly suggest you think about who your sender is. It's probably someone on your product team or your leadership team, but it's more about, believe it or not, male versus female. Anywhere I've been and in studies I've read, more often than not, female-led sender conversational ads outperform males. Not every time, but a lot of the time. And whether it's male versus female, if it's product, if it's marketing, if it's sales, if it's the C-suite, there's fun and there's value in simply just changing your sender, changing the voice, trying to put a different face, a different brand, a different profile in front of that end user is another great one. In terms of conversational ads, again, this one is probably a little bit niche and narrow, but if you're thinking about your combo ads and the way that they appear for your end user, it's not in their newsfeed, right? It's in their in-mail box. If you're on mobile, or even if you're doing it on desktop, you have a really, really small amount of space for your subject line. And I've always found, probably like email or other places, if your subject line flows and line breaks and you can't see the entire subject line, it becomes a lot less compelling. So this is one where less is definitely more. And the suggestion on the experiment is to compact your headline in that combo ad to as few characters, as few words as you can, so they can actually see the whole offer, the whole subject line in one view. They don't have to scroll. They don't have to index in. They can see exactly what you're talking about. And usually it's like 4 to 5 words. So it's not easy to do, but it's a great test. And inevitably, again, with headlines, you can test a multitude of versions of that. Another unique one, another more new feature on LinkedIn ads is document ads. And one thing that I've seen more recently with the document ads is, yes, the essence of a document ad is versus telling somebody, hey, look at my creative, click on my ad, go to a lead gen form, go to a landing page and download this thing. Instead, with document ads, it's saying, hey, I've got a 15-page ebook. I'm going to show you the first 3 pages just to give you a tease, get you a flavor for this, entice you to go make the download? Well, one of the easiest experiments you can run on this type of campaign is the number of pages that you're visualizing for the end user. Done a lot of experimentation here. It could be 3 pages, it could be 5, it could be 10. The essence of the experiment is to test your way to figuring out what the right number of pages is that you're visualizing for that end user to entice them to convert. The last one, maybe the most obvious, but it's something we come across a lot. I come across it, all of us at Metadata come across it, is too often campaign execution is centered around landing pages versus lead gen forms. On a Meta, on a LinkedIn, you can use a lead gen form. We always recommend, by default, we've found in the data that lead gen forms work better. But again, it's relative. Landing pages may work better for your brand because you have a very colorful, vivid, very unique experience on your landing pages. That could help it work better. But the experiment here is to basically put the same campaign together, route half to the landing page and half to the lead gen form, and see exactly what your conversions net out, as well as what your quality nets out. So you've seen this one here on LinkedIn. You're also seeing it on the Meta side. So over to Meta, the last section, creative. I mean, this one's obvious. Facebook is very, very much a visual platform. I liken it to Instagram. A lot of ways it does overlap with Instagram these days. So you have full autonomy and full opportunity, even more than on LinkedIn, just to test your creative and test it aggressively. Do things that are dynamic, do things that are static. The amount of text in a design. We know back in the day, Facebook used to have limitations and really be mindful of how much actual text was in your design. Those days are sort of fallen by the wayside, but it's still a case where you can really load up text in your design, or you can have very minimal text. How are you packaging that creative design with your headline, with your description, with your CTA? Creative design, at least for me in terms of Meta, is again, it's a green field. You can test creative forever. Now, we also know that over time, especially if you ever use Facebook ads, Meta ads natively, I should say, they keep adding placement types, more and more of them. And now you have the ability to choose. You can take them all. You can let AI help you, or you can manually decide. I would suggest trying all of those things. Try your feeds, try your taller creatives, try your more narrow creatives, try your blocks, try where you're placing them. If it's in a video feed, if it's a carousel, if it's in search, wherever it is, Meta offers you so many placement options. I would always advocate to try as many as your design allows or you possibly can. Another one here, we know that over time, the data availability and how smart we can get with our targeting on Meta has changed considerably. If you recall, they got in trouble because of all the data they were allowing marketers to utilize, and those days are gone. And they've definitely changed, and that makes our job harder. But for the most part, there are some wonky interests out there, but interests can help you. They may not be something that are standard and scalable for your campaigns, but they can at least give you an indication, if you include them in your targeting, who's right and who's not for your advertising. And obviously they're very easy to just, you type something in, you see what your audience options are, their sizing, and you bring them in and bring them out. So I would again suggest, test your interests. Again, they may not always be precise in the way that you want them, but a simple example is you try a campaign without any interest. You're using geography, you're being very fundamental in your campaign experiment. But then you come in and you say, okay, we're here talking about finance. I'm going to go grab a couple of interests relative to finance and put those in, and then I'm going to stand up my general campaign versus my interest-based finance campaign. Which one is performing better? Obviously, if your finance one does, you double down on that. You do more with that. So interest is another sort of sandbox you can always be playing in and experimenting with on Meta. Last one, calling it out again, lead gen forms versus landing pages. Again, you can do the same thing over here. Try both sides, see which one works. If you find a pattern, maybe you think about what's on your landing pages, you think about what you're asking for in terms of the number of fields in a form, etc. There are a lot of ways that you can test these, even the mechanics of the form itself. Okay, almost to the finish line here. I want to leave you with one really key statement, and this is something I've said myself and remind myself many times over many years of doing this. Experiments are called that for a reason. What I mean by that is that they don't always work, and they're not expected to always work. How I kind of back that from my own experience, and this is really interesting. I told you exactly how things work and how it went for me at IBM. Had a great run. It was a great stop in my career. Did a lot for their SaaS program. My mandate from my leadership was only seeing 3 out of 10 experiments succeed, which, even when that was presented to me, seemed very, very odd. It seemed like a really, really small number. We ended up netting out about 6 to 7 out of 10 being successful. But again, there was already a cultural expectation and an acceptance that these are experiments, these are tests. We have an idea, we create a hypothesis, we identify a metric that we want to influence, and then we go run the experiment. It may not work. It may be inconclusive. It may work well and be explosive, and then you double or triple down and make it a standard. Or you could learn something entirely new that you weren't expecting that tracks you into another experiment framework. There are many ways it can go, but the reminder here is they're called this for a reason. They don't always work. Their main benefit is learning something new. It may be learning exactly what you hoped. It may be learning something entirely different. And the final statement, success is a bonus. When they work, that's great. Scream it from the rooftops. That's amazing. Evangelize your experiments. But on the other hand, I like to recognize the ones that don't work just as well. They're almost more valuable because they're teaching you and guiding you in a new direction. So again, a little bit of philosophy here. If you take anything from the session, just remember the nature of what you're doing. They're experiments. They don't always work, but you always learn. With that said, that is all I have for the session. And I did see a couple of questions come through. Hopefully that was helpful for you. Like I said, the invite is there. You can reach out to me personally on LinkedIn or any other way if you want to continue the conversation, like me to check out your ideas, your experimentation framework, what you're working, anything. I'm happy to. I totally geek out on this stuff. But for now, let me take a look at the questions that we have. I see 6 questions over here. Amazing. Thank you, guys. So the first question, any tips on running experiments with minimum budget? I'm assuming this means. If it's, well, in the context of budget, something I always like to say, even if you don't have much, the best way to go about it is to sort of create less stress and less pressure for yourself is set aside a small slice that's only for experimentation. And again, that may seem ambitious if you already have small numbers that you're working with. But again, in that way, it's not taking away from things that you always need to be running, that always need to be on. And it always gives you a sense and a small expectation that you can run tests. And it's not creating friction or disrupting anything else with your budget, anything that's standard and static for you. If you come back and say, dude, I've got no budget, literally, I have no money for this, well, obviously that removes some of the context of paid advertising. But there are an infinite number of things that you can test outside of paid media. And again, I had a lot of that experience in other places. You can test your website all day long. You can test your CTA. You can test your navigation. You can test your hero space. You can test dynamic things like modal windows, pop-ups, offers. There's a ton that you can do in your journey if you are lacking budget on your website. Same thing goes with landing pages. One of my other favorite places to test, again, if you're strapped for cash, is your email marketing program. Same deal. You can test headlines all day, subject lines, preview text, the CTAs, the format, the delivery time, the cadence of an email workflow. There's so many other places you can go experiment. Probably another conversation for another day. But yes, in the context of today's topic, paid advertising, testing, inevitably, experimentation gets a little bit harder when you don't have much to work with. So, I mean, one way to view it is you put that experimental budget aside. Another way is you say, well, this is only what I have to work with. I'm going to experiment with my budget. You can even view it that way, that, great, I've got $5,000 in ad spend a month. I need to test my way into understanding the best use for this. So that's another way to kind of view this if you have a small budget. You either go offline and go off of it paid and do things in other places, or you take what you have and you sort of embrace your bootstrapness and you test into understanding how best to maximize that 5,000 or whatever that small budget is. Thanks for the question. Next question. How would you recommend prioritizing experiments? One of my favorite questions. And there is some debates out there in the world. There are a couple methodologies. There's the PI score. There's the ICE score. There are other things that are unique to individuals. For me, going all the way back to IBM, when I did this in agency, and even when we have a nice, robust list of ideas here at Metadata with some of our projects, I try to use the ICE score. ICE. It's an acronym. And the I stands for impact, the C stands for confidence, and the E stands for ease. So what you would do in this case is you've got all your experiment ideas lined up. Then you look at each of them, and obviously there's a little bit of subjectivity to this. I liken it to I liken it to Yelp. Some people never give out 5 stars at a restaurant. Some people only give out 5 stars at a restaurant. So there's a little subjectivity. But with the ICE score, you look at that experiment, you say, 0 through 10, how impactful I think this is going to be. Then I see C, confidence. How confident, 0 through 10, do I feel this is going to work? And then E, 0 through 10, how easy or hard is this experiment going to be to execute? Then you take your 0 through 10 scores and you aggregate them into one 0 through 10 score. And then you start to rank your experiments top to bottom. Two things that are really important and philosophical on this one for me. Whatever scoring system you're using, you want variety in experiments. It's always tempting to go out for acquisition, to always be ads, to be content. But no, you should consider the breadth of what you can do and ensure that your experiments are spanning different areas of your program. Another thing when it comes to scoring, any scoring methodology, it's super easy to just grab all the tests at the top. My 7s and my 8s out of 10. Those are the easy ones. Those are low hanging. They'll work. Those are the ones. Sure, start with those, but I always recommend that you take only 80% of your experiments from the top of your scoring, and then you go down to the bottom, to that bottom 20, the crazier things, the more wild ideas that you might have, and grab a couple of those and test those too, because those sometimes are the ones that work best and they surprise you. So that's a little bit on how I view experiment prioritization and scoring. Okay, next on the list, what's the minimum investment you would recommend for an experiment if you are testing creatives on LinkedIn? Well, setting the metadata philosophy aside here a little bit, I'll go back to the Big Lebowski. It's a little bit relative. It depends on what you have to work with, right? But at the end of the day, even in the study that I shared around the amount of spend, around the amount of velocity, there's some relativity, but I would say foundationally, you need to give any experiment at least a week. At Metadata, we say even longer, up to 2 weeks or a month, depending on what you're spending. So it's kind of a convergence between the time that you have and the amount of spend that you have that will guide this the best. But I would say, even in the example that I gave, you probably want to spend no less than $500 to $1,000 on an experiment that you're really curious about, you're really adamant about an outcome for. You have to give it at least an adequate amount of spend. And really another way to view spend, a lot of times going into a spend conversation, I'm going out and looking at competitors and seeing what they're spending. It's very easy to do on a tool like SpyFu. There are other tools out there like Moat that can tell you exactly what your comps are spending. Super easy to do on Google Ads as well. So that's another point of relativity when it comes to spend is, yeah, if I'm recommending 500 to 1,000 and all your comps are spending no less than 30K a month or 1,000 a day, you stand no chance. So you really have to think about what else is out there and what you're working against when it comes to what is the least you can spend on a given experiment. Okay, next one. Thanks for the question. Many times I find it difficult to keep track of all the experiments. Do you have recommendations on how to be able to keep track of them and assign next steps accordingly? Great question. I have lived this one in many ways. Even thinking back to the IBM days, the number of different tools that we used over the 4 years I was doing that work to track our experiments probably changed 5 times. We used, as crazy as it sounded, we used GitHub. Yeah, it's a tech company, but how in the world are you going to track experiments in a clean and linear way in GitHub? Well, we tried it. We used Trello. We used Asana. We used spreadsheets. So there isn't one foundational tool. It's more about what matters most to you when you're tracking. And if I'm thinking about tracking, what's important to me in tracking is, of course, you have all your experiment ideas laid out. You've used some scoring system to elevate what's the most important to you, or objectively how you want to go about working them. So that's that overlay. You've got all your ideas out in front of you. Then once you've started to score them and lay them out, it's really about what goes into each of them. You want to make sure that you have a hypothesis, you have a success metric, You have a description for what you're actually trying to experiment. And why this matters in practice is, let's say you hit a home run with an experiment and you want to evangelize it to your leadership, to your entire company, whoever it is. Having that overlay going into the experiment tells the story for you. You can say, well, this is what we saw in the numbers. This is what we thought would happen. This is what we tried. And this was the amazing outcome that netted from it. So I'm a little agnostic on what tool to use, but let me just say it this way. I mentioned a couple of tools we're all familiar with, and a lot of them come with a cost. My agency, we built an experimentation framework that is now turned into a software. But for 3 years plus, we were selling it to clients, and all it was a Google Sheet. It was a very, very sophisticated Google Sheet with tabs and macros and color coding and drop downs and many, many things that made it very, very sophisticated. So if you're bootstrapping it and you're on a budget and you can't grab a tool like Growth Hackers or Trello or Asana or something, again, that, really is a project management tool that you're morphing into an experimentation tool, I could very, very quickly and easily give you multiple frameworks for tracking your ideas and your experiments using a spreadsheet. It can work for a long time until you outgrow it. Hopefully, because your experiments are working, company's making money, and you can upgrade. But believe it or not, very, very simple here. You can start with a spreadsheet and it'll get you really, really far for a really long time. Obviously, if there's a broader team, there's more people contributing to experiments. You've got product, you've got design, you've got your performance people. You might benefit from something more than a spreadsheet. But if it's just you running experiments, a spreadsheet will probably do the job. Last question. Do you believe in using lookalike audiences in Meta? And if so, do you prefer driving traffic to an LP or a lead gen form? Great question. A little bit into the science of meta ads. I would say, personal bias aside, lookalike audiences more often than not will work. It may be self-explanatory, but I've always found, again, I can think of some very, very recent, like relevant examples from work I'm doing, even as recently as last week, where we were contemplating just that. Do we want to run meta-native campaign? Sorry, do we want to run meta-native audiences where we're putting in our firmographic, our demographic parameters, and it's spitting out an audience and it's giving us a projection, and then we push the campaign up against that? Or do we do a 1%, a 2%, a 3% lookalike where we're saying, show us as much of what resembles what's worked for us and what's converted or what's in this profile as possible? And oftentimes, even in this most recent example, the lookalikes far outperformed what we were doing natively. So I would say, if you have the opportunity, again, perfect example of an experiment concept. You're curious if lookalikes are going to work well for your brand or your campaigns? Set up a native audience, set up a lookalike audience. Give them the same exact campaign, same exact experience, side by side, compare them. That's exactly what we did in the example that I gave. We tried both, and the lookalike outperformed. Our CPLs were half as much as the other one, and inevitably now we're standardizing and doubling down on the lookalikes. To the second part of the question, I alluded to it before. We often find that lead gen forms outperform landing pages. The main reason being, think about the experience when you've come across an ad that leads to a landing page or a lead gen form. It's all about friction. A lead gen form is less clicks, it's less friction. There's a certain level of comfort if you're on a Meta or you're on a LinkedIn and you see something that's interesting to you and you click the ad and you bounce. It sends you away. It sends you to a site. It sends you to a landing page. It's distracting. It's something that diverts your attention. Whereas if you have a lead gen form, your attention stays right there natively in that screen. You're still on Facebook, Meta. You're still on LinkedIn. You're still in that comfort zone of a channel that you trust and a place that you trust. You're not being distracted by navigation and dynamic things on a web page or a home page. No, you're still centered right there. And it's much easier and more comfortable to make the conversion. So what I would say, again, consider your brand, consider your experience, but I've always found from a friction and a performance standpoint that lead gen forms work better. And I definitely know that from a metadata standpoint and all the great studies and data and research that the company's done, that's also been validated, is that lead gen forms are the way to go. But with the caveat, that you should always test both ways. That's all the questions. Thank you all so much for joining me. And again, the invitation is real. Let me know if you want to catch up on any of this in the near future. If we're not buddies on LinkedIn, reach out. You can email me here at Metadata. whatever works. I'd love to look over what you're working with, either the data, your framework, your campaigns, whatever it is. I'm sure I can help and provide some objective advice and feedback on exactly how your own experimentation program is going. Final statement, ABT. Always be testing. Everyone have a good day and great holiday.